everyone, and welcome to another author interview for the month of July. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And my guest today is another first timer here on the channel. She is an author, dreamer, and adventurer. She writes badass characters slaying dragons. She enjoys combining action with character driven stories that feature diverse heroes and heroines. Her debut novel, Bones to the Wind, is a 2022 Black Book Award winner and a 2022 Indie Ink Award finalist. Apologies. She is a proud blurred. She taught English in South Korea, studied abroad in Japan, and spent her debut year traveling the world. And it tells all about Bones to the Wind and her other book, Sister Samurai, which I am very excited to showcase on the channel very soon. Let's give a huge round of applause to author Tatiana Obi. Tatiana, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Gabriel.
You're welcome. Now, before we begin, do you have any copies of your books you would like to show the viewers?
Yes. So my debut duology, it is complete. It begins with Bones to the Wind and Dragging Your Bones. So they're pretty thick books.
Nice.
And then my most recently published book is Sister Samurai, which is a novella. So it's a little bit smaller, but just as beautiful as the other ones.
It looks so good. And honestly, when I looked at the cover on your website, the first thing that came to my mind, which I think you wrote in the bio of the book, is what's that anime with uh Afro Samurai?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So the book is an homage to that anime, and there is a lot of references in it, because growing up, it was one of my favorite animes, one of the only animes where, there's a Black main character, but there weren't a lot of Black female characters represented in the story. And I was like, well, I want a Black female samurai, so I'm just going to have to write it.
Nice. So before we dive into your works, Tatiana, is there anything else you would like the viewers to know about your background? Were you always interested in writing growing up and stuff like that?
Yes, so I kind of just started off as a writer. I was kind of just a natural storyteller. I was been writing since I learned to read. And and it's always been something I've always been doing it as a hobby. I've always been doing it kind of on the side because, kind of growing up, you always hear the adage that writers don't make money, like that you can't make a living writing.
Right.
So for a long time, I kind of just put it to the side and it was just a hobby. But it wasn't until the pandemic where I finally decided that, I want to get my stories out there. You never know what's going to happen. You never know what day is your last. So it's like, let me put my stories out there before it's too late. Yeah, it sounds kind of morbid, but I think the pandemic really put a lot of things in perspective for a lot of people. And it was just something I always wanted to do. So I finally kind of just jumped off the cliff and got it done.
You know what? That's 100% correct. And I've had a lot of authors on the show who said exact same thing, that the pandemic was truly the awakening for a lot of indie authors to create their own stories. And just hearing about that, I was like, wow, I wasn't the only one, because I was just like you. I created my first story during the pandemic and got the second one taken care of around the same time. And the third one, the final draft, was written just after everything started settling down. So it is crazy. Plus, it's another way for us writers not to get completely lost and just stir crazy. At least with writing, we can put our craziness down to paper and see, okay, that definitely needs to change. But going forward, what was sort of now looking at the Sister Samurai, what was sort of the aha moment for that? Sorry, I know you said that Afro Samurai was a huge inspiration for it, and you want to take your own swing at the genre, but was there any other factors in the creation of Sister Samurai?
I think also coming off of a very long duology, which is pretty lengthy. So I was like, okay, I want to in a way have fun. Like I spent years creating the duology, and so now is my turn to be like, okay, let me have a little bit of fun with it. Let me do a couple of things that I've always wanted to do. And so in creating it, it kind of became like a love letter to like the Black women in my life, like my friends and family. And I've just been so grateful by the reception of it. People seem to enjoy it, but yeah, like it's just it started as a fun project, something to kind of like a big swing in the other opposite direction after coming off of this huge duology. Like I needed a break. I needed something fun.
Dang, you're probably the second author that I have on this channel now that's written a duology, and I always find it very fascinating because when we think of like series of books, the more common thing is, of course, the iconic trilogy, because
Yeah.
that's how you can flesh out the whole story. But I've only interviewed, now you've been the second, two authors that have done a duology to wrap a story up completely. I can't even imagine what that must have been like to do all the research, the plan. Okay, here's what's going to be in book one. Here's what's going to be in book two. So let's actually talk a little bit about that. So when you were crafting the duology, what was sort of the need and desire you wanted to satisfy for your prospective readers, as was your goals with creating the series? Did you initially want to do a duology, or did you want to do a trilogy, but then realizing the story, you decided a duology would be the best format?
Yeah, so my intentions was not a duology starting off. This like the duology was kind of a reimagining of a story that I wrote in high school.
Okay.
And you start writing, and then I think it took me 4 years to finish that book. And it was by the time sometimes when you get to the end of the book and you look back on it and you're like, I'm not happy with it anymore. Like
Mm.
suddenly, you've grown as an author over these 4 years. So like your tastes have changed. You're like, I'm not really enjoying the story anymore. So I ended up shelving it. So going back to the pandemic and going back to deciding to indie publish, I was really considerate on what is the story that I wanted to debut with. That kind of
Mm.
wanted to announce who I was, like what my brand was. And I came back to those characters that I wrote in high school because those characters have stuck with me. And so I kind of not really tossed out the story. I kind of I it's more of a prequel. The duology ended up being a prequel to the story that I wrote in high school. So it's the
Oh,
same
okay.
characters, but a completely different story. So because of that, I had quite a bit of the world in my head, and I had these characters with me. I knew, some characters you write and they're just off. Like
Hmm.
exactly how they are. And my intention, since I was indie publishing, a lot of I feel like sometimes it's easier, especially when you're a debut author, to get into standalone books, kind of just like
Yes,
one-offs. And that was my intention to do a standalone book. But I'm an epic fantasy writer, and it was very, very big. So
yes,
I had to split it up into two books because as an indie publisher, you pay for proofreading by the word, you pay for copy editing by the word, and like when you have a lengthy book like that, it is very expensive.
it is.
Um, so having the ability to kind of split the book in half allowed me to pay to publish the second half, quite frankly. Um, and so that's how I got the duology out. It was initially conceived as one big story.
Nice. And what about Sister Samurai? Was that initially planned to be a novella, or did you want to try to flesh out to be a standalone novel?
It was actually meant to be a short story.
Oh, okay.
And of course, it grew beyond that and became a novella. So, I've learned that what I intend to do tends to be like times two after I'm finished with it.
Oh my gosh. But that's like the fun thing about, writing, is that we always like to add more stuff to the story, even though it goes beyond our goals, which, I completely understand. My book that I'm writing right now, which is actually a samurai story, which
Fun.
I'm now realizing I'm not even at like the halfway point in my character's journey. I'm on chapter 26 or 27. I'm at 432 pages, and he's doing his own little side quests that the character's doing like for like 4 months before he goes back into war. He's actually, well, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but he now becomes another character based on Japanese film Zaitochi, the blind
Ah,
samurai. So that's a little teaser I'm just gonna give, but he's now going through that process. But you
what's
know,
that? So is it Japanese historical?
yes, it is, and it actually is actually one of the things that really drew me to the samurai, because I love, samurai culture among many things. It's very, very fascinating, and it really hooked me in, which actually lends perfectly to the next question, Tatiana, which is, when you finished writing the duology and the novella for Sister Samurai, what was the feedback like? The initial reaction, were they positive, negative, mixed? And this is going to be a little challenging one. Do you have a fond memory of a review for the duology and Sister Samurai?
Ah, yes, I do. It's like I remember when I first put the duology out because, I had written all at once. I had published the first book in March and then the second book in November. So both books came out
Mm,
all in the same year. Um, and when I first published the first book, I don't know, like the reviews were coming in and they were really nice. And to me, I was like, I must have got really lucky. I must have just got really like some nice reviewers. They seem really sweet. And it wasn't until probably a year into it that it hit me that I was like, oh, wait, no, it's actually good. People actually like it and they're not just being nice about it.
oh, okay.
So I don't know. I think it's not like that imposter syndrome when you first start. Because when you're a writer and you're like writing in your little cubby your cubby
Yes.
hole, and you don't you sometimes you're really surprised by the reception. You're like, oh, that's yeah, I guess I am good at that.
That actually is very true. And you actually bring up imposter syndrome. Sorry, I have a little thing in my eye which is bothering me. Apologies. But you actually brought up a very important thing when it comes to imposter syndrome, which actually leads into this next question. So ultimately, the reviews have been very positive, and I would imagine at that point, it sort of like validated your goals setting out with the duology and the novella. And I'm sure you can definitely imagine, Tatiana, that for a debut author publishing their first story, it's a little intimidating to present your work to the masses because, as you said, your story, your duology was like 4 years, and that was research, getting everything situated, making sure the characters were exactly what you wanted. And that's just the story. I'm not even talking about, finding a site that's actually going to organize the book exactly the way you want it. If you want to go to Amazon or Barnes Noble and distribute there, finding an editor, finding a cover artist, all of that takes a lot of money and time and planning. And even when you finally get all of that and present it on the digital stage, there's that voice in the back of every author's mind that is imposter syndrome telling us, what are you doing? You shouldn't
Yeah.
be doing this. You wrote a book that pretty much everyone has read before. What makes yours so special? So for you, Tatiana, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome? And if not, what has continued to discipline you to continue writing stories, because deep down to your core, this is who you are as a human being?
Yeah. Like kind of going back a little bit to the previous question to answer this question. Um, the duology taught me a lot about myself.
Mm,
And it also taught me what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were. So going into Sister Samurai, I was a lot more confident. To hear readers say that we really enjoy your fight scenes, they're very cinematic. We really enjoy your settings. We really enjoy this. And so it's like a book like Sister Samurai, I'm like, oh, I feel confident that I can tackle that now. So without the support of some of the reviewers that I got from my duology, I don't know if I would have been confident enough to do Sister Samurai, honestly. Just because, you know, with that imposter syndrome, it really kind of skews your vision of things sometimes. That being said, what keeps me going is just, I feel, is my passion for storytelling. Because you get so, you do daily get so many doubts.
Right.
But I remind myself that I started writing for myself. I started writing because there were books that I wanted to read that I wasn't seeing these stories, and it's just like, well, someone needs to write them. Like, I wanted to read them, so I guess I needed to write them, and that still very much is the motivator for me. There are just so many stories left to be told that haven't been told, so many narratives that just haven't been explored yet, and
Right.
it's just like, well, that's what keeps me writing. Like, despite what every, despite the reviews, despite criticisms, it's I'm a reader and I love stories at heart. And I want these stories to exist in some form. So I
Definitely.
can't wait.
You know, that's 100% true. No one knows our stories better than ourselves. And if we're passionate about these stories, we should share them, which actually now leads into the next set of questions, which is now the business side of being an author. So, the next question, which I think is very important, which is the route that every author goes through. It goes self-publishing and or traditional publishing. Now, Tatiana, I forgot to ask this in the beginning of the interview, but can you tell us a little bit more about your duology and Sister Samurai, and also tying it back into the main question? When you crafted the stories and realized, okay, these are the stories I want to tell, did you want to try your hand initially with self-publishing, or did you want to try your hand at traditional publishing, doing research into, okay, which publishing houses are going to like this book or at least seem interested in this book or books?
Yeah. It was, back when I was in high school, I, had the idea that I wanted to eventually publish a novel. And so I've always been kind of watching the industry and watching trad publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did have the intention to do trad publishing. So I think it was out of college that I decided to write a story. Um, and I queried that story. But eventually I decided, and after going to some conventions, I decided that trad publishing just wasn't the route that I wanted to take. Um, and, I say this because I feel that some stories are more successful with trad and some stories are more successful with indies. For example, like Sister Samurai, right? Like,
Right.
it's appeals to the target audience is like Black women nerds, anime lovers,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a target audience that trad pub doesn't really cater to. They don't even really know it exists, like even how
Right.
to market to it. So when you have like such niche audiences like that, those are stories that like a literary agent will tell you they don't know how to market this. And I found myself that the stories that I tended to write weren't very marketable for trad pub. Um, and at that point, I was working marketing at a previous job. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you know what? I think I can do this. Like, I can find my audience. I can find my readers. I can find the people that, enjoy the books that I do want to write. And that was the power that kind of choosing the indie publishing route gave me. And that is why I decided to go that route, even with A Forging of Age, because A Forging of Age is a little bit more new adult transition to adult. And as you know, new adult isn't really a big category in trad publishing either. new,
Right.
new adult's more of a indie publishing genre. It really, like, that book really is focused on coming of age things in the transition between being a young adult and transitioning to an adult. That's what the entire duology is about. So when you're getting those transition kind of stories, it doesn't fit neatly into trad pub. Um, so kind of just thinking of the stories that I write, where would they fit? And indie publishing was the route that I decided to take.
Awesome. And can you briefly tell us about like what are those books about your duology and Sister Samurai? Because they are, I got a chance to look on your website and They were really, really interesting, but I don't want to butcher up the synopsis. Can you tell us a little bit about all three books?
Yes. So, Bone Stow and the Duology is about a coming of age competition, and where there are two rivals competing with each other on this in this coming of age competition. So they have to go into the desert and hunt down a monster and bring it back in order to become an adult in their society. But these two individuals have been childhood rivals for a long time, and they do not get along, and shenanigans ensue. So the competition, you have wind ships, you have dragons. It's a very sword and sorcery type of adventure.
All right.
And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Nice.
And with Sister Samurai, it is again, it's an homage to Afro Samurai, but it is about Sister Samurai. She is the last of her clan, and she's out running errands, and she's just trying to get home. But there are several demons that keep getting in her way. So with her swords fucking around and find out, she's gonna take care of business.
Awesome. Oh man, I'm gonna love reading Sister Samurai because it honestly, my head canon to that, which I don't know why, and I wish it actually was, that before I even read the official synopsis, for me, I thought Sister Samurai was this possibly the child of Yasuke, probably one of the most famous black samurai in Japanese history. That would automatically be a good book, but for what you told me, yeah, this is definitely like something that's an homage to, the hack and slash anime, especially Afro Samurai. So I cannot wait to read that and be a part of this new audience that you created with Sister Samurai, as well as your duology, which now leads into a perfect segue into the next question, which is the audience. And you actually touched on something that I didn't even consider, which is for indie publishing is able to explore new audiences that traditional publishing doesn't really market to because they have these standards. Which, now saying that out loud, it does make me realize, oh shoot, that's actually right, because traditional publishing has the standard genres, which is fantasy, high epic fantasy, a little bit of dark fantasy, dystopian, thriller, romance, fantasy, historical fiction, historical romance, whatever. And they have those established subgenres. With indie publishing, you're able to create new genres that may not be in the norm. In a case of, like, have cyberpunk, new adult, which I now just learned about that term from you, Tatiana, because I was wondering, I keep seeing NA on some of these authors. What does that mean? Now I know, and it touches a new audience. And I feel for any author, the audience is important and one that can easily be forgotten because, as you said, Tatiana, when you created these stories, you created them for yourselves initially because you wanted to read these stories growing up, but now you had the opportunity to write them yourself. So this is a two-part question. So the first part is, in your opinion and from your own experience, how important is it for an author to really understand who their audience is? And with the success of Sister Samurai and your duology series, do you have a better understanding and idea of your audience?
Um, yes, it is. It's really important to know who your audience is because, like, especially in indie publishing, because indie publishing, there's a lot of decisions that you have to make, and you hit on this a little while ago, Gabriel, on how there's so many choices, whether we should go KU, whether we should go Amazon, whether we should go Ride, like how our covers, how should we price our covers. Knowing your audience help you answer those questions.
Yes.
So for example, if you're writing romance, we know that the romance, fantasy romance genre is huge in KU. Like it's and so like if that's, what you're writing, go where your audience is, and that's where your audience is. So knowing who your audience is helps you market your books better, and kind of know where they're at.
Right. And you know what? Honestly, it is very, very true. Like, write to the audience that you know that you're going to have the best relations with. And I'm going to touch on this later, but I do want to bring it up, which is because I think at this point, the business side of the author comes out in terms of like, going down the pathway of, do you want to be an author or do you want to be known as an author? And we'll touch on that towards the end. But now the next question, what I think is it's more of a fun one, which is, for all authors, we're always inspired by all the books we've read growing up that really help us come into our own as authors. For me, I grew up reading Brian Jacques' Redwall. I love that series. That was a really big inspiration for how I approach fantasy. And for the history side of me, Alan Smale, Bernard Cromwell, Valerio Manfredi, and so forth. All those authors have really played huge roles for me and helped me establish who I am as an author, because I think for us, we're always inspired, but we don't want to take away from these authors and be like, oh, the next J.K. Rowling or the next George R. R. Martin. We don't want to initially start off as that, because for us, we want people to have an expectation of us as authors. When they pick up our books, they're going to know, okay, this is a Tatiana book. This is what I'm going to expect. Or this is a book by Gabriel Garcia. This is what we're going to expect from him. So ultimately, Tatiana, the question I am proposing to you is, what were some of the authors and books that really helped you come into your own as an author in terms of character development, world building, narrative structure, narrative style, and so forth?
Um, I've been a fantasy reader ever since I was young. Like I think the first book that really pulled me into the genre was Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the Dragonland series by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis. Like they picked those books up and that was it. It was dragons forever after that. And then I also really appreciated the Alana series by Tamora Pierce.
Okay.
Because it was the very first kind of like female driven fantasy series where you really saw kind of like just female narratives being showcased within a fantasy setting. And I just really appreciated that. In addition, my first picking up Glenn Cook. Glenn Cook, who wrote The Black Company, who kind of like predated the term grimdark, but that's the type of stuff that he writes. And because even though I enjoyed fantasy, the stuff that I was writing didn't really fit into like high fantasy or classic fantasy. Like I didn't really, I didn't really care about elves or dwarves.
Right.
I didn't really care about making up fantasy races or, like good versus evil. But when I picked up Glenn Cook, it was finally a reflection of someone who was more similar to my writing style. It's like, oh, this is what I write, which is very kind of character focused, smaller narratives. Like for example, the fate of the world isn't, in danger. And a forging of age is these children's adulthood, it's these children's livelihoods that's in danger. It's much more personal goal. And those were the type of stories with, also very flawed, morally great characters. But kind of bringing in all those influences, making them, unapologetically female narratives and female narratives in fantasy. And just bringing all of those influences in.
Nice.
And, yeah, just I feel like you can see a little bit of all those things.
Awesome. And now going to the next question, which I think is also important, is the readership. And the reason I bring this up is that for me, the audience is different from the readership, because you can market to a particular audience, but your readership is drastically different from your audience. And to give a perfect example, one author who I had earlier this month, Eric Bowden, who wrote a book that was supposed to be the bridge for people who grew up with Percy Jackson, who are now transitioning out of the Percy Jackson phase and now going into George R. R. Martin and the other epic high fantasy stories. And then another author who I had featured on the show, her book was very much the same thing. It was a dystopian world where, again, it was like a bridge for people who grew up with the dystopian young adult series of novels and now transitioning over into the adult fiction dystopian era. So it's really interesting to figure out, okay, who is exactly my readership? Who am I really trying to cater to? So for you, Tatiana, do you have a good idea of your readership? And do you think it is important for authors to really fine tune who their readership is? Because you can market to everybody, but you kind of get lost. And it's like, okay, my book isn't necessarily romance fantasy, but it has romance in it. It's not dystopian, but it has those elements.
Yes. So I think what helped me a lot is one, being a reader and kind of being a reader within my target audience, because I know what they're reading and I know what they're talking about.
Mm.
So, for example, with Bones to the Wind, I was, and again, it is a bridge kind of series going from YA to adult, kind of going from, for example, Children, Blood and Bone to N.K. Jemisin, like bridging that between young
Okay.
adult and adult fantasy. And so I was very particularly targeting Black fantasy readers. I was targeting readers who pick up diverse fantasy books. You know, those readers who like pick up Fonda Lee and then go to N.K. Jemisin, then go to R. Kwong, then go to, like they're looking for unique worlds that they haven't read before. They want
Mm.
to be transported to something new. Like they're not looking for standard medieval European fantasy. They're looking for something to kind of to challenge them and to take them to someplace new. And
Right.
those were the readers that I was targeting, especially with this duology. With Sister Samurai, I feel it was a little bit different because while there was some correlation between the readership of the previous duology and the readership of this duology.
Hmm.
Not all fantasy readers watch anime.
That's true.
So this was also kind of drew its own audience in a way, and I kind of had to build my own audience for this one
Hmm.
because the target audience I consider is Black girl nerds who enjoy
Mm.
fantasy. That's very tiny and very specific.
Right.
Like those ladies, they're usually actually reading manga. So to bring them over to this would be a little bit more difficult. So the way that I see it is that's the bullseye, but there's a lot of rings and there's a lot of communities around it. And so I
Right.
try to market to those communities around it. So I try to market to those Black fantasy readers. I try to market to those anime readers. I try to market to those action fantasy readers. So all the ones like on the outside and pulling them in to my audience. So for example, like when I put this cover out, a lot of people was like, "That's Afro Samurai." I'm like, "Yes, I'm marketing to you." Like I put this out and say a Champloo novella. They're like, "Oh, Samurai Champloo." I'm like, "Yes, I'm marketing to you." So there's all these little small references that like the audience that recognizes them to show them that like, yes, this is the book for you. Come read it.
Nice. And this actually leads perfectly now into the next question, which is the probably the most important question of the business side, but I'm going to give a little context to this. So, as in the beginning, for every author, there are two pathways, which is to be an author and to be known as an author. And I said this numerous times on the show, but for me, I think every first time author wants to be the other half, the latter, where they want to be known as an author. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can be known that. There's just a lot of trials that have to go along with it. But let me just give a quick little definition for both. For the other one, which is to be an author, for me, that is someone that is solely dedicated to the art of storytelling and crafting narratives. Yes, money is important, but it's not the driving force. It's not the reason why you are writing. You are simply writing to tell stories. And yes, the capital comes in is very good. To be known as an author is someone who wants the world to know who they are. That is marketing the book, really fine tune the story, joining the local trends in the publishing world and so forth. And that's all great. But I definitely feel for any first time author going down that route, it's easy to get lost in the sparkle. Because I'm sure, Tatiana, you probably have some people who have reviewed saying that your book should be changed. It's not really going to hit the audience. Oh, you should add this, and trying to change the story from its original conception to one that's not really the story that you set out with. And for all authors, our stories constantly change. It's an evolutionary thing, but that's different as opposed to you are simply changing your story solely for the fact that you want to join a trend that's happening in the publishing world. And one thing that another author gave me, which I love sharing on this channel, is this: for any first time author, indie or going traditional, there's no guarantee that your debut anything is going to be the start of your legacy. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it is true. Now, there are exceptions. There are authors whose debut works skyrocket them to award winning status. Congratulations. All the congratulations to them. That is a hard work and dedication. But on the other side of the coin, you have authors that rise, fall, rise again, and fall down even hard. And now imposter syndrome is back with a vengeance, and it's much more prevalent. And it ties back to, well, what were the goals you set out with? What were the long-term goals? And ultimately, I'm sure, Tatiana, you've probably had people who you've met that they just start off as writers, but over time, the passion kind of died when they were trying to make it a business and it's not fun anymore. And that's very, very sad. So, for you, Tatiana, in your opinion and from your experiences, how important is it for a first time author to really understand that there is no guarantee that their debut novel is going to be the start of their legacy as a writer, but it should not deter them from creating stories and being a storyteller?
I think it's really important. And I also think you know, it's important to understand both. And I see the successful authors being both, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of that understanding of understanding the industry. So once you understand the industry, especially indie publishing, your first book skyrocketing and being that winner, that's not that like that's very uncommon. Like that is a very rare phenomenon.
Right.
If when you do your research, you realize that especially with indies is the strength of the backlist. Like the indie authors that are successful are the indie authors that are consistent with putting out work. They have a backlist so that when people read, if you can attract that first writer, they'll move on to your other books. For example, with Sister Samurai, after I got off of the duology, there's a lot of stories I want to write. But prioritizing which stories I want to write was a business decision. I saw that Asian-inspired fantasy was becoming more popular. You have like Sword of Kaigen, you have Never Die, you have
Right.
like all of these stories that are becoming more popular. There was not a Black Asian-inspired book out. There was a hole there. There was a hole in that genre that I knew that I could fill because honestly, in order to do this story right and to do the story correctly, this definitely has to be Own Voice's work. I don't think this can be done by someone who is not Black. And so those were business decisions, but at the same time, I still wrote the story that I wanted to write. So being a storyteller, I have all these stories that I want to write, but bringing in the business side, I prioritize which ones. So, for example, after this one, I'm currently working on the next book. It's set in the same world as my duology, but it's in a different place. So it'll be a standalone sword and sorcery fantasy. So people who haven't read the duology can pick it up without any problems. But people who pick it up, it'll have some returning characters. They enjoy the characters. They can go back to this duology. So it's kind of an interconnected world. So writing what you want to write, but also being savvy about it, I think can be very, very beneficial as an indie author.
Definitely, 100%. And also to add to that, grit trumps talent. No matter how good you are at writing prose, no matter how good you are with character development or anything in publishing, grit will always trump talent because it is a grind to create a story that's going to be out there. And it may not be your first book. It may be your 10th book, maybe your 20th book that people know you the most for. But when that happens, let me tell you this. Hey, If you like my 20th book, you should see books 19 all the way down to 1, and boom, you got new readers. Because ultimately, those 20 books don't have to be in the same series. They could be different books, different genres, targeting different people, and you get new audiences, which is incredible. And ultimately, grit transforms into talent because as authors, we're constantly evolving our language as storytellers. We're constantly realizing, okay, I got to get rid of this. I got to change this. People said there's too much of this. And we just constantly refresh and retrain ourselves as writers.
Yes.
Plus, it also helps when we have a good group of people who are fellow authors who know the grind, who know the struggle. And I've seen a lot of that on social media when it comes to Instagram, TikTok, or otherwise known as Book Talk, which is crazy. And I've learned so much from all those authors who have really helped me understand myself as an author. And as I'm sure you know, viewers and listeners, a majority of the authors on Instagram are probably my biggest lineup of here on the show. In fact, that's actually how I met our guest today. Tatiana was actually on Instagram and looking at her stories and her posts, which leads to this little fun question, which is for you, Tatiana, who have been your biggest supporters of this journey of yours, looking back to this point in your life right now?
Um, so definitely family. I wouldn't be here without my family. But there has been just some great authors that and community, and I just want to say, like, being a beginner writer and being a beginner author, it sometimes can be hard to find that community. Um,
Right.
and I've been very fortunate to have finally found a community. I have just a very close knit community of other Black female fantasy writers, and we share a lot of information with each other, and it doesn't even have to be like authors particularly in your genre. Like, I definitely recommend to go out and talk to authors. If this is what you want to do, go talk to authors. For example, as you were saying before, Gabriel, with about grit and determination, I've seen some writers whose books blow up like 2 or 3 years after they published, because indie
Mhm.
publishing, they never go off the market. Like, they always exist.
Yes.
They blow up 2 or 3 years later, and hopefully you got some other books that people can read, and you talk to authors, and that happens. You
Yes.
see, like, all these occurrences that happen, and so kind of having that network and sharing information, and even just being in these spaces like Book Talk and Bookstagram and on Threads and Twitter, like having people talk, having indie authors being transparent with their data, and like with their marketing techniques, with their initiatives, like it is just a very, very sharing and generous community. It really is. You just have to get in there.
Definitely, definitely. And oh gosh, I was gonna say something to add to that, but it will come back to me. But another question which I haven't really asked in a long time, but I definitely think it's really important as almost like a reflection. So for you, Tatiana, meeting these fellow authors who you've interacted, who have shared their secrets with you, have you ever gotten a sense of validation from these other authors who have picked up your work? And I ask this question because it's one thing to bring your knowledge into an industry and show people who you are. It's another thing entirely when your peers recognize your work and give credit where credit is due. So, for you, have you ever had those experiences with other authors who have come across your work, who have either read a few pages or read the whole book and told you their thoughts?
Yeah, all the time, actually. Like, I remember, for example, publishing my debut novel, and as a debut, I didn't have any social media. No one knew who I was, so like there is some hesitancy in regards to like new indie authors. Um,
Mhm.
but like, some authors have been very grateful and kind of read the book and given a chance, and it's just like, and they're just like, wow. It's just a complete 180. And yeah, they asked me for questions and advice and help, and that's how I kind of finally was like, oh yeah, it's a good book. I like, for example, even Sister Samurai, it's hilarious because it feels like this is a writer's book, because you'll have um, reader reviews, but the writer reviews are very interesting. It gets a lot of positive responses from other writers because they're able to go into, especially a novella, and they're like, you did all of this world building, you did this whole character arc, you did all of this within 150 pages. What? And that's something that writers understand. That, oftentimes if you're not a writer, or if you're a reader, that you don't really see.
Right.
So it's been great seeing those responses, and just being able to interact with my colleagues.
Awesome. That's actually really, really nice. And you know what? At the end of the day, we're all trying to help one another and trying to help each other grow. I know this is a business and we're all in competitions that people say we are, but we're not trying to bring each other down because we're all in the same boat. We're all going through our own struggles, which is important because as writers, it's not easy. Ultimately, as we talked about, viewers and listeners, being an author is not a sustainable. I can let me phrase it. It's not a get rich quick job. It's not easy. And for people who think it is, it's not. You have to literally create something new every time to build your brand as an author. And even when you do, there's like no guarantee like, oh, this is going to be sustainable. That's not to say that you shouldn't stop writing. It's going back to what we talked about. What are your goals at the moment? If you do not think you can be a full-time author, that is completely fine. You can still write, you can still craft stories on the side until you reach that point where you can live off the success of your books, which I think that's the ultimate dream for every author, where we can just live off the royalties of all of our stuff, which at the end of the day, as I said, that is the ultimate dream. Now we've arrived at the final question of this amazing interview, Tatiana. So here it is. With everything that you have learned at the beginning and still learning now about the indie publishing world, with all the advice you've probably gotten from your friends, family, and fellow authors who you've interacted with over the years, what is your word of wisdom to fellow first-time authors watching this video right now who want to get a head start in their writer's journey?
um, don't, as we had said before, like this, it really does require grit and determination, and passion. Like you do see a lot of authors kind of falling off after a while, and that's fair. Sometimes people only have one story, and there's
Yes.
nothing wrong with that at all. And my biggest advice is to kind of sit down and determine what your goals are, because I promise you that everyone's journey is going to be different. Like everyone, like has a different audience, and that audience
Yes.
can often sustain different pacings. Everyone has different, or beginning with different resources. So you can't compare your journey to someone else's, and you really need to decide what your goals are. What do you want to share your story with as many people as possible? Do you want to break even and make an investment on your book? Do you want to do you want to make this a business, or is this just a hobby? To definitely determine your goals on the outset before you kind of like jump in.
Right. And that is a perfect way to end this incredible interview. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Tatiana, for coming on the show and showcasing her 3 books, The Duology and Sister Samurai. Tatiana, thank you so very much for coming on the show. Where can people find and engage with you on social media if they want to reach out to you? And where can people purchase your books?
Yes. So you can find me on my website at tatianaobey.com. I have signed copies up on my website to be purchased, but you can also purchase it from other vendors. I'm a wide author, so that means Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Kobo, anywhere. Like online, you can Google it and it'll pop up. And again, there's Sister Samurai, Bones to the Wind, and Dragging Your Bones. And you can also find me on social media everywhere at Obey the Author. So on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all of those social media channels.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And as I said in the beginning, viewers and listeners, be on the lookout for my initial reaction review of Sister Samurai, because I will be reviewing it. And when that video is up, I will tag it in this interview right here. And the same thing with the video for the interview there. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. Again, a huge thank you to Tatiana for coming on the show. We wish her the best in her journey as an author, and we cannot wait to see what else she has in store. And don't think this will be the last time that she'll be on the show. Who knows? Maybe she'll be back again. Actually, no, she probably will be back again to tell us about her next book that she teased a little bit in this interview. So just be on the lookout. Make sure to follow her to stay up to date. And until then, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview and what book was your favorite that we discussed in the interview. Until then, this has been The Wandering Scribe signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.